Welcome to Counterpoint, where Iranian thought leaders and opinion makers, as well as non-Iranians working in the field of Iran, will tackle top currents and developments involving Iran, her society, her position on the global scene, explore where she may be heading, and options available to her. Joining me for our first program is Dr. Shahriar Ahi, a spokesperson for Iran Transitional Council, which is an organization for transition to democracy in Iran. Dr. Alayar Kangarlu, a physicist at the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University, and Dr. Hassan Mansour, professor of economics at American Graduate School of Paris. Welcome, gentlemen. Dr. Ahi, I first turn to you. And could you please give us a sense of what are the current trends and developments regarding Iran? Where is Iran today?
Well, to put it in context, Iran is under authoritarian, ideological authoritarian, better call it totalitarian rule. And totalitarian states have a lifespan. There are distinct phases in the life of a totalitarian state. They normally start with the revolutionary phase, when there's a new ideology and promises heaven on earth and solution of all the problems, and idealist youth join it. There's an explosion of participation. But after a while, they find that just because no ideology can answer all the problems of life in the modern world, that it's not that solve all total answer to all questions. The rate of acceptability falls from 90% to 70% to 50%. A group of people within that system say, well, we got to do some reforms. The pure ideology, the zealotry doesn't work. Certain people disagree. They think there's a threat to the ideological system. So that's the second phase, the phase of reform. Time goes on. Again, the ideology doesn't allow you to, just like a democracy, keep on adjusting your policies to the reality, changing realities of the world. And popularity falters. You go to 30%, 20% popularity, and this is when you have an aging totalitarian system. Critical thing is that certain equations of political development reverse themselves from first phase to the third phase. The most important one, the relationship between popularity or acceptability or legitimacy on the one hand, and the degree of participation and the degree of legitimacy. If in the first phase, the greater the participation, the higher the legitimacy. That's why the revolutionary system always encouraged people to be out on the street and active. In the third phase, it's quite the opposite. If you allow maximum participation, it becomes quite visible that your legitimacy has tanked, has minimized. That's where the Islamic Republic is right now. What does that mean? In a phase like this, they have to keep 90% of the population demobilized because they're a threat if they participate, and only keep 10% mobilized. That means repression. That means more zealotry. That means, well, actually radicalization, further radicalization. And also one critical element is normally it becomes more important for a regime like that to export its revolution because it has to show its legitimacy outside of the world when people don't really understand the reality of life under this sort of a system. And it becomes an additional threat to its region. That's where we are. Now, of course, the immediate issues impacting Iran where the bleeding of competence alongside increased zealotry has created conditions where socially, economically, degradation has become such that it's unsustainable. Dr. Mansour can comment on this much better than I can, but in the field of economics, there are trends that are simply not sustainable. The situation is so bad, it cannot get much worse. Or social issues parallel to that. The immediate news that might impact that, avidly watched inside Iran, is the US elections. They pin their hopes to Joe Biden winning so that the policy of maximum pressure of the Trump years vanishes. Maybe that'll give them a break. I don't think that it'll really solve the problems of Iran. And then its impact on the upcoming presidential elections in Iran. And I'm sure that the results in the US will impact the mood, the atmosphere in the elections in Iran, which promises to be one of the least popular elections ever because of where the Islamic Republic is. So here we are. This is the current condition of Iran.
Dr. Mansour, Dr. Ahi noted that the economic conditions are getting worse by the day, and of course Iran was at the epicenter of COVID, and certainly COVID is ravaging through the country. Even though the numbers, the statistics that we get from World Health Organization is not accurate, but it goes the same for the economy. So what is it, how can we make sense of these numbers and what is going on in Iran? What are your views?
Well, the problems of Iran's economy, they are very, very deep-rooted. They go to the very foundations of economics. So to begin with, the property rights in Iran, which have been tampered with and totally changed, it has made Iranian economy very, very unproductive. On the base of it, monopolies have grown and monopolies have become military and security monopolies. This is something which cripples Iran's structure and makes it non-responsive to economic stimulus. So this is the basic thing, that Iran's structure is a monopoly structure, and monopoly in the hands of the military and the security. That's one thing. Since then, we haven't had, during the past 40 years, any considerable growth. So the average growth comes to less than 1%. But during the past 3-4 years, we've been having negative growth. A growth of, for example, last year, a negative growth of 6% in GDP. And this year is also, we are heading to a negative growth. As to the complication coming from the side of the COVID, is something which is the last straw which breaks the camel's back. Of course, as you mentioned, the statistics from Iran are not reliable. It is something that even Parliament said, that the real numbers are about 10 times the size of the official numbers. And recently, a minister said that the real number is about 2.5 times for the disease. So this is a very complicated issue, an unfortunate issue. But Iran's production is down. Unemployment is rising. According to the statistics and predictions made by the parliament, this year, maybe we're going to have about 6.4 million people losing their jobs. A country which is already crippled by unemployment. So compared to this unemployment, with the side of it, you have the inflation. Inflation which had been controlled by the Rouhani government during the first period of its time. Later on, it gave up the reform for different reasons, structural reasons, and went back to the same channel of creating liquidity and hence handling the question of the problem of inflation. Now we have officially, about 30 to 35% inflation and an unemployment which is above, again, official figures, 13%, but in real terms are much higher. So this is compounded by another problem, that is loss of foreign exchange. because Iran's trade has been locked. And according to the latest figures from IMF, Iran's official reserve have gone from $122 billion in 2 years ago to about $8.8 billion this year. This makes the government very tight-handed. They cannot handle their internal problems as well as their external commitments. To put it in a nutshell, the current Iranian budget has been in deficit. The estimates about the deficit varies from 30% to 50%. My estimate is that it was about 50% deficit. And in order to cover this deficit, they had to resort to central bank and, of course, other sources, which created more and more inflation. But now, once you come to foreign trade, you cannot pay your imports by your domestic currency. So you need foreign currency. And this currency is not forthcoming. This is why this is the first year that we're having a current account deficit this year, estimated by IMF to be about 20 billion. And running statistics show something about 10, 15 billion up to now. So this has got to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't, then the government cannot make this importation. It's difficult. Then resort to the blocked exchanges in other countries. In the face of reduction of the official reserves, the government has some blocked funds of about estimated $40 billion in different countries like China, India, South Korea, and Iraq. They have been trying to snatch back some of it, whatever they can, but for different reasons, it's not forthcoming either. So there is no solution, there's no opening from that side. Now, add as a last point to this question, the commitments and very important and urgent commitments of the regime to its proxies beyond the borders. Those are the military who have put their own lives at stake. So they need their salaries. And this expenditure is quite colossal and considerable. So consider Iraq, consider Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. So this becomes a priority for the government. Whatever income they receive, the primacy goes to pay these forces, proxies, and later on spend it within the country. So this is a very, difficult stalemate for the government now, and there is no solution in sight as of yet.
Dr. Kangarlu, as both Dr. Ahi and Dr. Mansour mentioned, it seems that the government and those elite in control of Iran's policies are in a way waiting to see what will happen to the US presidential elections. Will President Trump get re-elected, or whether there will be a President Biden and a return to JCPOA? Now, how likely is it that there will be, what will happen in the US presidential elections, and how likely do you feel it will affect whether there will be a JCPOA2 or not?
I don't think that the result of the American election has any impact on the path of Islamic Republic on self-destruction. I think just like my friends Dr. Ahi and Dr. Mansour just told you about the historic perspective and economic perspective of the path to death in front of this government, in front of the Islamic Republic. The external affairs, like relationship, the friendship that the Islamic Republic is trying to establish with China or Russia, or the haywater that they're launching in the entire Middle East, the wars, the proxy wars in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, it's not going to help them. It can just prolong their life. But the more the life of this government is prolonged, the more tragic its departure and its death would be. So to put everything in the context of American election is really just another venue for this government to look for a rope of help from anyone. You know, the government even the government officials are confessing to their total inability to conduct the affairs of government. And this government, the group of this gang of criminals in power in Iran, they cannot even be called a government. They don't have any rules or any discipline in following international norms. You know, they're really violating all the international laws by developing a secret weapon development probably in deserts somewhere in Iran, and they have turned a political party in Lebanon into an armed group parallel with the military in Lebanon, and really they're causing a lot of instability, and they've turned the economy of Lebanon, a country that was thriving 30 years ago before the assault by the Islamic Republic, into a complete dysfunctional government. I mean, today Lebanon doesn't have a government. It's really a group of armed militia are ruling that country, and they have really destabilized that country, and 2-3 million people have really no certain future. So the government of Iran cannot hope that Joe Biden will bring them any relief. I think the way that President Trump has really set the rules for the way that the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, I don't think that Joe Biden will be able to easily reverse the clock and go back and reestablish his tie the way Obama was doing business as usual with the government of Iran. I think what we are facing in the Middle East, not just in Iran, but in the entire Middle East, and actually even broader than that, in the entire world of Islam, is a cultural war between Islam and the modern world. This is something that Christianity experienced during Enlightenment 500 years ago. You know, Christianity is a religion that is about 500 years older than Islam, and they went through this struggle, through this social chemotherapy of a religion. Anytime religion captures political power, it has to be able to run the affairs of society. And we know that no religion is capable of running the affairs of a society, whether it's economic, social, cultural, or otherwise. And the Islamists in Iran or in the greater Middle East, they thought that their religion is something magic with the religion, and they can do what the Christians failed to do in 15th and 16th century. They can't. And they miserably failed. And you see that what they're resorting to is resorting to terrorism, killing that poor teacher in France, and assassinating opposition forces all over the world. And everything that we've seen Islam doing in the entire Middle East in general and Iran in particular is really a desperate desire and a desperate effort to stay connected to the modern world. And they know very well, even the political leaders within the world of Islam and within the Islamic Republic know very well that they cannot handle the affairs of a country, let alone the affair of an entire region. So I believe that neither Joe Biden nor Trump will make a big difference as far as the certain doomsday that awaiting the Islamic Republic in the near future.
Dr. Ahi, Dr. Kangarlu mentioned about how Iran has changed, especially its views, the importance of religion, and surveys that have been done point to a society that is becoming increasingly secular. At the same time, other changes have taken place, as he mentioned, including a sort of retreat from its previous positions of strength, both in the Middle East and in North Africa. How do you assess whether the results, how the results of the U.S. presidential elections, how it will affect Iran? It seems that Iran is only positioning itself as a pivot against one country, and what will happen to that, please? Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. The question is, big question is whether the maximum pressure policy of the Trump period will continue, or if it changes in what fashion. Most critical question is whether more money is put into the hands of the Revolutionary Guard, whose mission is to oppress the Iranian people and export the revolution. like water lilies in springtime, articles are growing all over in the state. Oh, maximum pressure policy has not worked. What they're doing is they're comparing Trump's policies against Obama's goals, which were quite different. Obama's goal was single-mindedly focused on the nuclear issue. If you push back Iran from, let's say, having 3-4 months to build a bomb to a year, slightly more than a year to build a bomb, that's a success. And they spent all of the bullets, all the instruments of leverages that US policy had, including crossing their own red lines, credibility of the United States is concerned in Syria on the use of nuclear weapons just to appease Iran. But the Trump administration, the thought behind it, I'm not saying necessarily in the minds of President Trump himself, but the policy group that came to manage the Iran policy was, no, the nuclear thing is a subsidiary issue. The main problem is Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. If you didn't have a destabilizing Iran, you wouldn't have more of a problem with its nuclear weapons than Pakistan or India. So that is what needs to be contained and controlled. And that, of course, depends on the level of resources that the Revolutionary Guards have to create mayhem. And as those resources were cut by maximum economic pressure, we've seen the results. I mean, the youth in Iraq, in Lebanon, all sorts of places where Iran was exerting maximum influence, are out on the streets demonstrating against Iranian influence of the groups that are proxies for the Iran Revolutionary Guards. Iran's ability to create mayhem in the neighborhood from Syria, Lebanon, all the way to Yemen, even in Afghanistan, is drastically reduced. If you measure by that policy goal of Trump administration, maximum pressure policy has worked. Now, Biden administration comes, if it does, it will probably try to coordinate its policies more with Europeans, with its allies, which means a movement towards JCPOA. It's very doubtful that it'll go back directly to JCPOA when some of the provisions expire in 2023, just 2.5 years from now. Some of them in 2025, to allow all of the economic instruments in the hands of the revolution, Iran, which really means the Revolutionary Guards right now, in exchange for something that's going to expire in 2.5 years. So certain critical issues need to be re-examined. The principal one, which I hope the next US administration, whoever it is, has to ask themselves is, why does Iran want the nuclear weapon? It's not to use it. That's crazy. They know that they're infinitely superior. If they have 2 bombs and another force in the unnamed force in the Middle East has 300 bombs, you're not going to get away with it. But it's because Iran's technological inferiority vis-a-vis the West that it aims to fight makes her lose a high-intensity conventional war. So it resorts to low-intensity, call it asymmetric warfare. But it constantly has to deter escalation to high intensity, and that's why it wants the nuclear umbrella. Now, if you do a deal with Iran saying, I guarantee your security, they no longer need the bomb. If in the meantime you give Iran all it wants in exchange for that, Iran has lost nothing. You've lost all the instruments of pressure needed for containment of Iran's destabilization efforts. I hope that fact will be paid attention to a lot more than under Obama administration, whoever comes to the White House.
Dr. Mansour, one of course, President Obama's goals was focused on containing Iran's nuclear capability, but it was also to provide an impetus and encourage positive elements who can bring a change of behavior in the Islamic Republic. How do you see those forces that President Obama and others, quote unquote reformists, where are they today? And what prospects do they have for actually bringing about positive change for Iran?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, from the vantage of the United States and its allies in this JCPOA, this agreement, or whatever you want to call it, it was a beginning, and both sides understood it. There were second step, third step afterwards. So the main thing was the first to address the question of nuclear bomb. The second was to tackle the question of Iranian intervention in neighboring countries and non-neighboring countries, and so on and so forth. But from Iran's point, here I come to a deeper point, which may make a difference of analysis. The point is, well, analogies are rife about Iranian regime and the totalitarian Hitler's regime, Stalin's regime. And I'm sure there are a great deal of comparable elements to be found among them. But there is also one difference. And that difference is that both of those regimes, totalitarians, they were the aberrations of the modern. They were regimes based on the foundations of Reformation and Renaissance, while Islamic Republic is a regime built on an older paradigm, which is pre-modern, and it has great deal of differences. So, from the point of view of Iran, that agreement, or whatever you want to call it, because it didn't have a name, it was a respite, a breathing point, in order to rejuvenate, re-strengthen itself, to build up. This is why, once we came to the second step and third step of this JCPOA called Barjam inside Iran, the leader said there is no second Barjam, there's no third Barjam. We stop there. So negotiations and proceedings stop there. This is a very important point. Now, I come to, it is just to explain very briefly. Once we're talking about the Islamist regime in Iran, we're talking about one utopian state which is surrounded by a real country's world. From the point of view of the beliefs and ideology, the Iranian regime is the truth. It is the real. The rest of the world surrounding it, they are ephemeral, transitory. Let me tell you something which is funny. Once Soviet Union declared that Paris doesn't have a metro station. They don't have an underground system. Well, they knew that both in London and Paris, underground system was built early 20th century, some 30, 40 years before they were saying this. But what did they mean when they said the Moscow underground system is the only one in the world? They meant one thing, which is understandable and justifiable in accordance with the principles of the ideology, that this is the only underground which is going to survive. The others will be annihilated. So once the Islamist Republic enters into negotiations, it has its own principles. We have heard this story great many times, that President Trump has said Iranians were cheating, while Europeans, Chinese, Russians, and IEA, they have said no, they were compliant. So where is the truth? Yes, they do comply, but they do not comply. So this is the important point. They would comply with the letters, they would not comply with the soul. Because the soul is a part of the ideology. It is the belief. You talk about two countries or two people. They have a difference. They want to negotiate. What is the objective of this negotiation? It is to find a middle way and compromise. Once you have an ideology, there is no compromise. You cannot compromise on your beliefs and principles. The compromise is to buy time and a respite, to postpone it. Otherwise, you wouldn't. Now, take many, many examples. No time, I only mention one. Look, on the motto and the flag of the Revolutionary Guards, they write this verse from Quran saying that equip yourself to the highest weaponry in the world to cause terror into the heart of your adversaries. All right. In the meantime, the issue of fatwa, to which, unfortunately, a president of the United States like President Obama makes a reference saying that Ayatollah has issued fatwa. This is to fall into that trap. 1,000 fatwas, they do not have the value of a verse from the holy work, holy book. So the aim would not change. The aim would be to procure the nuclear bomb. Dr. Ahi mentioned that if you say that, well, this and this, so you wouldn't need, we give you security commitment, and you wouldn't need the nuclear bomb. But they will again try to get the nuclear bomb. Why? Because it is an instrument of casting terror into the hearts of your adversaries. And the adversary is well defined in the Holy Book. So why Iran sits there in Iran, its own country, and stretches its long arm into Syria and Beirut? Isn't that to surround Israel? Well, the adversary is very well defined. Whatever they do and whatever they say, the goal of annihilating Israel will remain. So even if they have no power to annihilate, but they can threaten, cause terror into the hearts. So a final point, once you negotiate with such a country and their leaders, well, do they believe in what they say and what they sign? Well, again, if you do not know the soul of this regime, if you do not know the holy verses of this regime, if you do not know the tradition of 1,400 years, and if you do not know their jurisprudence, you would not be able to judge, because they have a right to lie to you, to put a signature, in the meantime believe that they're going to violate it. They can swear oath, in the meantime they know they're going to violate it, because they are not questioned according to the texts. They are not questioned for violation of their oath. They are questioned for violation of their real intentions. And real intentions are only in the heart. And only God knows the real intention. So I give you signature and I imply something, while my real intention is something else. This is why the chances of getting into any viable agreement with the Islamist Republic in Iran are very meager. There is a question of negotiation and later on controls. This is there. But if you think that they admitted they will never do it, unless they have they eradicate in their beliefs or change the system, which they cannot, They will follow their own goals and stick to it. And cheating is quite admissible and acceptable.
Dr. Kangarlu, of course, Dr. Mansour explained where the state of the mind of the elite, of the leaders of Iran is. From your experience as far as Iranians are concerned, and specifically those outside of Iran, there's a difference between their worldview and what their aspirations are and what is happening inside Iran. Am I right in thinking that? Do you see it the same way?
Well, you're right. Actually, in terms of, I can tell you that the popularity of President Trump in Iran is very high. While Iranians outside Iran, President Trump might not be as popular, for instance, among the Iranians outside Iran, because the majority of them are highly educated and they're left-leaning rather than judging the presidential candidates of the American presidency in terms of a single issue of Iran's interest and the support and the policies that can lend stability to the regime in Iran. So these are the things that are very important as far as the difference, the discrepancy between the opinions of the Iranians inside Iran and outside Iran is concerned. But what is important, is really the fact that Iran has a regime ruling over it that its national interest, every other country in the world, its national interest, and is closely tied with the survival of the regime. And therefore, regimes, by pursuing their survival, they're really pursuing the national interest. In Iran, there is a regime that has an entirely different consideration and aspirations than Iran's national interest. In fact, the government officials repeatedly and publicly declare that they are not pursuing Iran's national interest, and they're pursuing the interest of what they call Islamic community, the world Islamic community, what they refer to as Ummah. Therefore, their survival and their interests and their aspirations are in conflict, a 180-degree conflict with the national interest of Iran. Any regime that puts itself in conflict with the national interest is doomed to fail and doomed to die, and they will eventually be thrown into the dustbin of history. That's the doomsday scenario that I see for this regime, and there is no evading that. Nuclear power will not do that. The conflict, this artificial conflict that they have created with the United States and with Israel, is not going to solve that. Israel is at least is a regional superpower, is a technological power, is an economic power, is a military power, and now with the policies that President Trump has pursued in his first term of establishing ties between Israel and some of the Muslim countries in the region, like United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and now Sudan, I think that taboo has broken. Now Israel, most of the Arab countries in the Middle East are now viewing Islamic Republic in Iran as their primary enemy, and they no longer view Israel as their enemy. So the conflict between Israel and the Arab countries is about to be dissolved. And that is a big blow to this conflict-ridden policies that the Islamic Republic has been pursuing in the last 40 years. And the Islamic Republic has lost its credibility even in the eyes of the people who are traditionally pro-Palestinian policies. And therefore, really, the Islamic Republic, to the confession of its own officials, has no friends around the world or in the region. And now all of these issues, all of this erratic behavior that they're exhibiting around the world and in Iran is because of that, because they are really desperate in guaranteeing their survival. They see right in front of their eyes that they're falling apart, and the economy, their popularity, their stability, even their aspirations, the philosophical aspirations, the love of Islam, all of that, they have been discredited even among the faithful and among the Muslim believers inside Iran and outside Iran. Therefore, I think the death of this regime is inevitable, and the policies, as far as your specific question about the relevance of the American election to the survival of the regime is concerned, I think the policies that President Trump has put in stone in the last 3.5 years, in the last 4 years, has made a conflict between the Western world, between the free world, specifically between the United States and Islamic Republic, irreversible. This cannot be solved unless this regime accepts certain principles within that 12-item declaration that Secretary Pompeo declared. And if the government consents to accepting those 12 items, I think the government has dissolved itself by accepting those. They know very well that they cannot. They are not in a position to accept give any concessions to those 12 principles, establishing ties with Israel, pulling all the forces outside all the foreign countries, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and stopping being belligerent towards Israel and towards the West, and all of that. Following human rights, respect for human rights inside the country, and calling all the assassins and terrorists from abroad. None of this government thrives on those principles, on those 12 items, and any regime, any government, Biden administration or Trump administration, they cannot get this government to abide by those 12 principles, to behave in a normal fashion, in a way that all the normal countries and the normal governments in the world are behaving. Therefore, I think the government is really doomed to follow its erratic behavior, its terrorist policies, and its suppression of masses, and its conflict with the modern and every aspect of modernity until the last day of its life as a government.
Dr. Ahi, in this round of questions, and I would like to wrap it up after that, I want to look to the future. I mean, certainly Dr. Kangarlu mentioned human rights. Human rights hasn't figured a lot in the past few years, past 4 years, as far as Iran is concerned. And also we have seen a schism between Europe and the United States as far as their policies towards Iran is concerned. As where you are sitting and you're in touch with a lot of political groups inside and outside, and you have the pulse of this movement, you can feel it. Can you tell us, how do you see where Iran is heading, and whether it will, whether Europe and the United States can at some point have a position, a common position in support of human rights in Iran?
Well, first I'd like to amend something that, without disagreement, amend something that Dr. Mansour said about it implied you can't deal with Iran because of its ethos, because of its ideology. It will always lie. It's in the gene of Islamic theocracy that they would lie. I would say in diplomacy in general, you don't trust the other side not to lie. That's why you build in verifications. That's why you build in strong sanctions if verification shows that you haven't done what you said you would do. I mean, this is part and parcel of democracy, and it's not an exception of the of Iran, this ideological or totalitarian state, to want a respite. I mean, the Molotov-von Ribbentrop agreement was a respite by both sides. SALT I was a respite. We now know what the Russians were saying. They all want eventual victory of their ideology, and they buy time. But the control mechanism from the other side has to be strong. Now, if you say plain and simple, you can't have an agreement with Iran because Iran will not abide by it because it lies, I think the record shows the opposite in the case of JCPOA. All three European states, major powers, Britain, France, Germany, not just Russia or China, even IAEA itself said Iran complied with the agreement and the US broke it. I mean, that's a fact. If you're talking about unreliability, clearly the US had been more unreliable on JCPOA than Iran. Everybody except for Trump says that. But you have to make sure that you've got a very strong verification policy and very strong sanctions. And if you do both, then I doubt very much that Iran would go ahead and build a bomb, because they would be sure that if the verification system is strong, that it'd be discovered. And if the sanctions are strong, they'd be sure that there'll be a Western or Israeli attack on the Iran nuclear facilities before they build a bomb, or just around that time. I mean, that would be a successful agreement. That would be successful deterrence. It's not based on faith that you're a good guy, you accept by what you say. That's not the way diplomacy works. Now, back to your question of human rights. I think there's a huge struggle opening up again, despite Fukuyama and the end of history, again, between two kinds of forces of liberal democracy, respect for human rights, popular sovereignty, and forces that are against it in the world. And it'll probably manifest itself post-COVID in the US-China rivalries, not US-Russia rivalry. And the strongest weapon, as well as ideal, as well as the basis of having a civilized society, is human rights. It's the biggest vulnerability of the other side. And Western democracies would shoot themselves in the foot not to make that a huge element of their strategy, basing their policies on that, because then they will forget the greatest vulnerability of an enemy of democracy and human rights that should not win.
Dr. Mansour, what are your thoughts? What are the trends we should also be looking for? I mean, we should be looking at.
You're talking about the human rights question.
Human rights, yes, and also what trends should we be looking for inside the country to see where, at least, where the country and its capabilities are heading?
Right. Well, as to human rights, let's again make a comparison. Hitler's regime and Stalin's, they did not respect human rights. Of course, then we didn't have the charter, but human rights, the spirit, it wasn't respected. But there's a difference between them and the Islamic Republic of Iran, because in Iran, human has an ideological definition. It is not physically inviolable. You can lash human beings on the streets. You can hang him. You can shoot him. You can knife him. You can behead him, according to the holy texts. So that's a definition of human. So once you talk about I've written an article about it. Find one single article out of the Charter of Human Rights that the Islamic Republic does not violate. Article 3 on life, liberty, security, and of a person is systematically violated. Article 5 on torture and subjection to human and degrading punishment. It's daily practice. Article 9 on arbitrary arrest. That is more than normal. Article 12 on arbitrary intervention with privacy. Article 17 on right to own property and the prohibition of arbitrary deprivation of one's property. You even today have the revolutionary courts which expropriate anybody's property without compensation. Article 18 on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the right to change your religion. You know the people who are persecuted in Iran for their religions, and you change your religion, then you are doomed to death, and so on and so forth. So this is the question. The difference, if we do not see the difference between a Pinochet regime who does not respect human rights and the Islamist regime who does not respect human rights. This was an ideology for not respecting the human rights. The other one doesn't. So you pressurize and you put a system of sanctions and verification, as Dr. Ahi mentioned, then of course they will retreat. But if these people retreat, they will do their torturings in private and hidden, because that's what they believe in. So this is the basic question. So far as the same principle is staying, you can't have an improvement. You can have verification and pressure. So far as the control goes, they will have the semblance of obeying and abiding by the rule. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it because they don't believe in it. So which law in the country, in any country, accepts rape? It is a very common practice in Iranian practices, raping of women, men, adults, and children. It is a common practice, right? Because there is a belief in it. It is ideologically indoctrinated in the system. So this about the human rights question. Human rights can proceed so far as there is resistance and the people and campaigners of human rights are organized and push the regime back.
And they're very much more organized nowadays, aren't they?
They are getting more and more organized, of course. And this consciousness of rights is now growing in Iran. It's become more and more common. So this is the hope. So far as this one goes, then the system will retreat because they never declared that they will do it. So once they are powerless, they're a minority, they will pretend to be lovers of human beings, respectful of women, respectful of children. It is when they are in power, they show their true face. So as to the future of Iran, I mean, that's very, about Iran's immediate economic prospects.
Yes.
Now, strangely, the American election has become the most important event in the annals of Iran today. Without having any concrete plan, we know the scenarios. They have written up scenarios, 1, 2, 3 scenarios. If Biden comes, if Trump comes, if Biden comes and continues the sanctions. So different scenarios, right? But do they have a plan of controlling the corona crisis? No. Do they make an investment? No. Have they created a structure to do that? No. What about their economic problems? How do they intend to solve the problems? Do they do it? No. The point is, whenever you come, we have experience. How many times do we need to experience? The first round of Mr. Rouhani's government came with the agenda of reform. And the reform was to control the inflation first. He did abide by the advice of his good advisors for 3 years. And the inflation was brought down from 44% to 9%. Later on, due to the visible and understandable pressures, he left that reform path and started creating liquidity again. And before that, when it came to the question of reforming the monopolistic structures of the economy, he was resisted by the leader and the Revolution Guards. So he gave up. So that problem is growing and growing every day. And Iran is in the grip of a military monopoly. So with the monopoly, you have no way of reforming it. So we've got to see what the future holds. I do not expect that any government generated by the system will be able to do this. The problems persist, and I don't see anything but the real change of the same system until a reform program can be implemented.
Dr. Kangarlu, how do you are a professor at the Department of Psychiatry. put yourself in the heads of Mr. Rouhani and the leaders right now. How what are they? What kind of character? How would you define what is going on in them mentally, and what can one expect? How can Iranians actually? Because Iran is from statistics show us is a depressed country. The people have no hope. The government obviously has no hope. It's very silent on a lot of priorities that, as far as budgeting, as far as providing services. Where do they go from here?
I don't think you need to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist to be able to figure out the Iranian regime's policies and understanding and philosophy. They are driven by an ideology, by a bankrupt ideology, by an antiquated ideology, that all of its principles, as Dr. Mansour was just laying them down, are written in a holy book. And they are conducting their affair of the government with the verses of Quran, a text that was written 14th century ago. And they're hoping that they would be able to solve the modern problems with a verse that has, according to them, anticipated all the modern world problems. And they see that, from camp to camp, from battle to battle, from war to war, they are failing every aspect of modern life, and their solution for these modern problems are inadequate and a failure, and a total and utter failure. Dr. Ahi made a very good reference to Francis Fukuyama's book on the end of the history and the last man. It's actually a very relevant issue. The book that Fukuyama wrote is very relevant to our discussion, the discussion we're having today. Fukuyama was a graduate student of Samuel Huntington. He did his PhD in Harvard under Huntington. Huntington was one of the most astute observers of politics and sociology in modern time, in my view. In his book, the advisor's book, Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilizations, he anticipated that after the downfall of Soviet Union and the defeat of the socialist camp by the capitalist camp, the world will go to the next conflict, because history is written in terms of conflicts. And because history cannot stop, then the next conflict would be the conflict between the capitalist world, the free world, and the world of Islam. And that was the topic of his book on Clash of Civilization. His graduate student, Fukuyama, took a more radical approach to the same problem, to the problem that his advisor saw as a conflict between the Western world and the Islamic world. He basically, in so many words, stated that the Islamic world is really no match for the philosophy of liberal democracy. As such, liberal democracy has won the philosophical war and the economic war by default, and as such, the history will end. And that was the topic and the discussion of Fukuyama's book. I happen to agree with that. I think what Huntington referred to as civilization, Islam, present-day Islam, there was a time that Islam had a civilization. Today, Islam does not have a civilization. It doesn't have a civilization in the philosophical term. It doesn't have a civilization in technological term. It doesn't have a civilization in economic term or military term. Therefore, there is no civilization to have a conflict with. The conflict is from the point of view that I referred to earlier. It is a conflict within the world of Islam. It is a chemotherapy of Islam that the Islamic world is going through in order to adapt itself with the changes, with the modern aspect of life, with the individual right, with human right, with the human dignity, all the new philosophy and the new religion of the modern world. And the Islamic world eventually, after so many years, perhaps 10, 20, 30, perhaps even a century of internal conflict solution and internal war with each other, right now you can see that the conflict within the camp of Islam, between Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia is more severe and more irreconcilable than the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Israel and between Iran and Israel. Therefore, you can see that this conflict is really within the world of Islam. Of course, it will spill over and it will have an external manifestation, like the way that Islamic Republic constantly criticizes the US government or the Western government in general, European governments in general, and has really turned this internal conflict into an external conflict. There is no way that Islam will continue business as usual until it reforms itself, until political Islam is disbanded and it pushed to the private realm of the people's belief and faith. Islam has the same way that Christianity had no space in political arena in Europe of the 16th and 17th century, and eventually with the wars and the struggles of the Europeans and Christians, primarily, it was driven to the privacy of the peoples of the Christian homes in Europe and in the Christendom, basically. Islam will have the same destiny. It is really destined for the same eventuality. And Islam will eventually become a modern religion as a matter of personal conviction and private belief of the believers. And it will have no way of ever capturing political power, because it showed how miserably it has failed everywhere, from Daesh, from ISIS that tried to capture power in Iraq and Syria, and we saw how savage they behaved, and how all the public beheading and all the atrocities that Daesh committed in Syria and in Iraq, to the Islamic Republic and the public hanging, torture, and everything that Dr. Mansour just uttered from. It comes directly from the verses of the Holy Book. Therefore, the modern world cannot accept the political Islam in Iran, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Afghanistan, anywhere. Forces like Islamic Republic and Taliban and ISIS, they are on the losing side of history, on the losing side of time, and their time will pass, regardless of who they ally with, whether they ally with China or Russia or whatever they do. Even China and Russia themselves, they cannot afford to ignore their interests when it comes to dealing with the United States. You can see what's happening right now. When JCPOA was agreed in 2015, it was turned into a resolution of the United Nations, a UN resolution. It was confirmed by the US resolution, Security Council of the United Nations. But when the terms of the JCPOA came to expire, which actually expired on the 20th of October, the Islamic Republic was jubilant that that one of the terms of the JCPOA, which turned into a UN resolution, was the banning of Iran from buying and selling weapons. And Iran was really, because of the fact that their policy is primarily based on selling arms to the terrorist groups in the Middle East and around the world, they were really looking forward. They were counting minutes for the expiration of the JCPOA term, according to the UN resolution 1921. And the United States, what the United States did under Trump administration was that they take the argument to the UN Security Council that Iran has been in violation of the JCPOA. Therefore, they have to extend the terms of the banning on the sale and purchase of the weapons. Basically, everybody else in the Security Council voted against the United States, and the United States stood alone, opposing the expirations of the terms of the JCPOA. What happened as a result? China and Russia took sides with their proxy, with their ally, the Islamic Republic in Iran. But the United States single-handedly managed to dissuade any government from violating the US desire. This is not really a UN resolution anymore because it wasn't agreed upon by the members of the Security Council. But the United States single-handedly managed to impose its will on Russia and China. There we go. Therefore, if Islamic Republic is hoping that in alliance with China and Russia, they would be able to counter the weight of the US economy and the US politics and the US reputation and moral leadership around the world, they are really barking the wrong tree. They can never, ever match the United States in the conflict that they've taken with the United States. Therefore, I don't see any hope for the Islamic Republic to ever being able to dig itself out of the well that has fallen.
Dr. Ahi, I would like to end by the state of Iran, go back to Iran and its people. Certainly the civil society, the political society, there's been a renewed energy and vigor around in the past year or so. Actually, it started inside Iran with the protests, and we are seeing its reverberations outside in the activity on the internet, in the interconnectedness of the Iranian people through internet. And how do you see the trends there and where we'll be going? And after that, it will be the end of our program because we're nearly an hour long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nazanin. Let me go back to Iran, the most important thing and the condition of the Iranian people. And the greatest pain they all feel, universally, everybody in Iran, except for a very, very few corrupt officials, is the economic pressure. I was hoping I would learn more from Dr. Mansour, who knows more about it than I do, why the current situation is unsustainable. I will just say a couple of words on that. The Ahmadinejad government created 6 times the money accumulated since 100 years ago by pumping liquidity by various means. Liquidity in Iran was about 7 times when Ahmadinejad left compared to when he came to power. As Dr. Mansour said, Rouhani stopped that by going lower in inflation. They went from over 40 to under 10. After a short while, he discovered something he didn't know. He hadn't really realized how bankrupt the banking system was. What that meant was that he had to pump liquidity again into the banking system for it not to collapse entirely by various mechanisms. Now there's a formula, M1 liquidity is equal to 1 over reserve requirements of commercial banks times the base currency. If you essentially put away those reserve requirements by lending money, central bank lending money to the banks, that means that that reserve requirement comes to 0. So potential growth of the money supply goes to infinity. Of course, it doesn't reach that potential, but there's very little instruments of controlling it, and it keeps on growing, particularly when the real interest rate is very low. And so now, Rouhani government liquidity is about 5 times when they took over. So he's created 4 times more than on top of the 6 times, 7 times more that Ahmadinejad. This is unsustainable. It's got to the important equation of an economy of P equals MV. The liquidity in Iran right now is almost equal, very, very, very similar to the total GDP. That means V, the productive velocity of money, is 1. In a normal, healthy economy, is 4.5 to 5, like the United States. It's unsustainable. You cannot have an economy survive that consistently the velocity of money is 1, that liquidity is equal to the GDP. It's an explosive situation. The minute this money starts moving, the inflation skyrockets. Everything becomes unsustainable. So that's where we are. What is the solution? I don't think that the United States, with the change of policy, can do anything. I hope the situation doesn't get as bad as war. I definitely don't want any foreign power to attack my country. I hope the solution will come from inside Iran, and I'm sure it will, because the growth of frustration, the level to which this spring of compression has been pressed, is such that we will go back to Gandhi's statement about the Brits in India when he said so many British troops, 80,000 British in India, cannot stand up to 300 million people. 140,000 Revolutionary Guards will not be able to contain 84 million Iranians. And the only question is, does the clock of creating a reasonable alternative that could create, control a new legitimate order moves as fast as the collapse of the Islamic Republic? I hope so, because that collapse will not last long.
Well, on that note, I think we need to wrap up the discussion. And I hope in other sessions we can look at topics, bring in other speakers and experts, and just hopefully we'll meet here again very soon. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and I hope we can get together very soon.